Hi, I'm Theo, and these broadcasts are to support the blogs on nomoreshee.com's website as well as the online classes. Welcome back to the No More She broadcast. We're going to continue today our series on prophecy and prediction. As when most people approach biblical prophecy, they seem to approach it as if it's primarily, and the most important thing being prediction. Now, there are verses in Isaiah that talk about how God knows the end from the beginning. And there are many people who like to point to the prophecies in the Bible as a proof, to prove that the Bible is far above any other text that we have. That's understandable, but is it exactly what the text is trying to do in distinction to all other texts? Is that the primary purpose of the text? Is for us today to read it. For instance, many people got away from prophecy, but in 1948, when Israel returned on the map, many people began to see that as prophecy in the Bible being fulfilled and began to understand, and what led to Israel being put back on the map. And the problems that still relate today because of it, and the ideology that's behind it, is still problematic. And how to sort through that theologically. Is the land of Israel today something that God desires to give to a certain people with certain genes or, certain blood pumping through their veins? Is that the purpose and the messaging of the text, that a certain group of people with a certain gene pool are entitled to a certain amount of land? And how much land is it? And when we talk about all that's involved in that, it gets quite tricky. And we talked about timing earlier too. What is the exact timing of the prophecies, as in when they were first pronounced, when they were first written down, and when did they come to the form that we have them today? In the sense that, when do we get the final form of these texts in the condition that they were then ended up being transmitted to us in that form? Now, I'm not talking about all the nuances between the translation of those texts. That presents a lot of difficulty in itself. But the final form of the text, as scholars look at it, that it was in this form, and that I like to think of it like concrete. When concrete is mixed and poured, it's worked. But eventually they stop working it, and they just let it, and it sets up, and then it becomes hard. And from that, then the remaining purposes of putting that concrete down can then be fulfilled, and often people drill holes into it or whatever, cut it, do whatever they need to do to finish the intended construction and project. And so the text is going to be worked and moved around about by God's people, with the editor-in-chief being the Holy Spirit watching over the process. But eventually it's going to solidify into a form that no longer is really changed. It may get transported, like some items that are constructed of concrete could get put in forms, and then the form's removed and everything is finished, and then it gets loaded on a truck, and it can get transported. And so that kind of idea. So the idea here is that there is a final form to the text that was then transmitted down through the ages as the tradition that ensues of how God chose to reveal himself to his people in this text, and why it's the Holy Scriptures, and why certain people groups, the three largest religions on the planet, adhere to those traditions in various forms. And there are many cults and and things that break off of that. But it when taken in the balance of human history, you can see the amount of people down through the ages that have revered this text in some sense, or the ensuing traditions that spring from the text and what it has. And so, how much emphasis on the text, when it's transmitted in that form, that then later gets, abused or twisted or turned or changed or whatever. And you have Jews that look at it one way and Christians look at another, and Muslims obviously entirely different. And you have all these other belief systems that have sprout out from those traditions and have, Jehovah's Witness and whatnot, that Mormons and whatnot that look at it entirely differently. And even like Anton LaVey's Satanic Church or whatever, they still, take from these traditions. And so they're still doing something with it. So we're talking about that final form of the text and how much influence this has. But then, at what point was it written down? And, the timing then. Was it, does it originate then so that the original prophecy is a prediction and then we look for its fulfillment? Obviously, 1948, that definitely, if prophesied, in the Bible that we have, no matter which part of the Bible you choose of the text, which again, if you go through our canon series, taking, for example, the Protestant Christian canon of 66 books, it doesn't matter which of those 66 books predict Israel coming back. But how much of those prophecies predicted that precisely is another question. And, this is what I'm trying to get at is very difficult. So I'm going to try to use an illustration. Most people who are listening to these broadcasts and watching may remember September 11th, 9/11, 9/11, September 11th, 2001, what happened in New York. And so, that's a major game-changing event in modern history, especially for those who are from America. But even outside of America, the events that followed that moment changed a lot around the world, perspectives and things. So that was a major event. And, can it be said that was prophesied, And so initially, one can maybe look at the writings of the guy known as Nostradamus, and, he wrote in such a general way that perhaps, maybe, what he said could be applied to that event. But I'm thinking more specifically that in September of 2001, I was reading a one-year Bible, just, long before we had all these wonderful ways to do it on a computer, although I did have some of that. But I actually had a physical book. It was called the One-Year Bible, and I was just following through the One-Year Bible, and it was the King James Version I picked up and was reading it. Now, again, the King James was written 1611. It's doing their best job to, put it forth the best effort to bring about the original language as much as possible with the tools and the availability of knowledge that they had back in that time period to produce this. And it's a wonderful piece of literature. It's one of the greatest hallmarks of English literature in existence today, and there's nothing wrong with it. But obviously, they did not have what we have today. And the question bearing, also, the English language has changed since that time period to now. And so I'm reading that. And in my mind, of course, is the images that I saw on the TV screen of, September 11th. Again, I don't recall having access to things like a smartphone or, instant news like that. So it was being at work, getting the news, trying to convince coworkers that it was not a joke, that it's actually something that really, truly happened. And, and driving home listening to the radio, and then getting home and getting onto the TV and seeing those images, that was just bizarre. And then reading, a passage from Isaiah and going through the book of Isaiah, and the 1 year Bible divided into like an Old Testament reading, a New Testament reading, and a Psalm and a proverb, and things like that, so that in 1 year's time you finish this canonical King James Protestant canon. And reading and coming into the apocalypse type, the apocryphal literature that's in chapters 24, 25, 26, and 27 at that time. And it was just remarkable. And for me to see, and subsequently I even preached on this, to the amazement of some, but there were others who organized the event that were astounded that I would do such a thing. And did Isaiah really prophesy that? I just, it goes along with like the Bible codes and this equal letter distancing sequence things they do, where they skip letters and pull out all these Bible codes, and they get, prophecies that have come to pass. And the funny part about it is there's not just one single authoritative manuscript of the Bible which we can just say, okay, this is the Bible that Moses wrote, and we can then just take a computer and go that, because there's so many manuscripts and they're slightly different. There's so many differences at the Dead Sea Scrolls in Qumran, discovered interestingly around 1947 initially, and subsequently took time to publish, and then it's been decades in the making for this to come out and people to translate. And what's fascinating, when you take it in the appropriate perspective, you begin to understand that taking a text from the ancient world and understanding variant manuscripts and going through it all and realizing the copies that we have of something like Homer and the copies that we have of the Bible, and then the differences in the Greek of the copies and the manuscripts that you have of something like Homer, and the differences in the copies and the manuscripts that we have of the Bible, and comparing that, and you find that the Bible is actually quite good. And there have been many people who have tried to say that certain parts of the Bible have been Christianized, even what Christians call the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, the Scriptures, parts of Isaiah, like chapter 53, the ending of chapter 52, how some groups said that was like, added by Christians. And then we have the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we have copies of Isaiah that prove that that's not the case. And so the debate begins then, how much can we say the Bible is speaking prophetically about an event like Israel coming back in May, 10th, I think, or so, of 1948, that kind of thing. How much can we say of that? And how much can we say that me reading the King James, and then I'm reading it through the lens of seeing what I saw on the screen from New York, and I'm in the Midwestern part of America. I'm west of New York, and it says in the east. And then I'm looking to my east, and I'm seeing what happened to the east of me in New York. And then reading, about fires in the east, as the King James has it in Isaiah chapter 24, 25, 26, and the windows, and all of that, go through there and just check it out. And then, if you're not paying attention, the King James translates this passage as fires, and the NIV as east. But and then, like the New King James has it, the dawning light. And so it's interesting to get fires in east. It's not even the same translation that I had to do this. So I'm really monkeying with the text because I want it to fit this situation because it's so prevalent on my mind. When Isaiah wrote, he's in Jerusalem and New York is to the west of him. It's like one guy said that he knew that Jesus Christ was coming back. He's figured it out that Jesus Christ, when he's coming back in the 2:00 hour, and it'd be 2 a.m. something, in that hour, but he just didn't know which time zone. I mean, 2:00 for who? 2:00 in the morning for who? Because it's always 2:00 somewhere in the world. That was his joke. And he's a prophecy buff. And, I've seen the people that have taken the Bible and they take Ezekiel, like, what is it, chapter 38 and 39, and this idea that there's something going to happen to Egypt, and, that there's Soviet-era nuclear subs parked outside of Egypt, when I was growing up in the news, and they saw that as Ezekiel 38 and 39 coming to pass, and that these Soviet-era submarines could launch these missiles, and it would cause a nuclear blast that would take out Egypt, and it would fulfill a literal reading of the poetry and prophecies of Ezekiel chapter 38 and 39. And the same thing can carry forward. People reading parts of Revelation where John is speaking about these creatures and describing them in such terminology that some people say, well, then obviously God was showing John Apache attack helicopters, military helicopters from the late 20th or early 21st century. And John didn't know how to describe them, so he described them in the best language he could. And they see that as their context, and they're led by what they say is the Holy Spirit, and they disdain scholars, and they disdain those who would say that we can look at other texts written in the Second Temple period, along with the Old Testament scriptures, as, the Hebrew Bible, the Hebrew scriptures. And they try to say that, John would not be riffing off of anything from the Old Testament. He's not riffing off anything in the Second Temple period literature. No, I read it from my late 20th or early 21st century by the Holy Spirit, and I think the Holy Spirit, the hairs raised on the back of my neck, and I think that means that it's talking about Apache helicopters, And we've discussed that numerous times on this broadcast. Even that in 2020, when the pandemic hit, and many people today, even still in 2022, are concerned about the pandemic and the fallout, and if this has been prophesied in the scriptures to have happened. And I keep trying to point to what my great-grandmother went through and how she made it through 2 world wars, the Spanish flu, the Great Depression, all of that, came out of it and managed to get through those times. How she did that in the previous century. And I keep hearing about these scientists describing these storms that we're experiencing that, only occur every once in a lifetime or once in a century, and yet they keep happening. They keep recurring, and it's like, this is the type of storm that you only see every one time in 100 years, and we keep seeing them. And, people saying these are all prophecies and they're predicted in the Bible, and this is what the Bible talks about. One of the things that does amaze me about the modern use of this idea of prophecy and prophets and the gift of prophecy is the fact that no one predicted COVID-19 pandemic. Yet there have been several high-profile people who claim to hear from God that have predicted on numerous occasions that this pandemic had ended long before that we could say that it's ended. And we're not even sure if we're able to say that now, that it's finally switched to a different level of endemic. Is that the case? And someone, was reading again the same passages of John about locust plagues, and there was a locust plague that hit, and it was in Africa. Just, they've tried to avoid these. We have high-tech military-grade satellite equipment to track these locusts, and we understand scientifically how a locust plague manifests, and we use these high-tech satellites to track these things. And when given the opportunity, we go in and we deal with it so that these locust plagues don't happen. But if a sovereign nation does not choose to allow scientists to go in and eradicate these locusts before they can manifest into a plague, then it gets out of control. And in 2020, that's exactly what happened. And locusts came up from Africa into India, all the way up into Nepal. And people were seeing that as what John was recording. And you have the locust plague, and then you have, it's all over the internet, YouTube, and then you have on top of it the COVID-19, as well as the more recent conflict between Russia and Ukraine. And you have that, and people prophesy. And I remember someone who prophesied about this Soviet area subs parked outside of Egypt at the time, in Ezekiel 38:39. And as a young person, I was very much enthralled in what they had to say. And they also prophesied that Mikhail Gorbachev would leave office, and he did. And they prophesied that Mikhail Gorbachev would return to office, and he never did. And they also prophesied that the HIV/AIDS was incurable, and yet they claim that because of COVID-19, actually, the technology used to make vaccines for COVID-19 has been in the making for a decade at least. And although some people disdained it because, certain portions of the research involved fetal tissue or embryonic tissue that, was part of somehow related to some kind of abortions, the technology that is used has saved many lives during the COVID-19 pandemic, and people are worried about that. That same technology has been used to make the vaccines in record time, save many lives from the virus, but also is being used now for treating possibly HIV/AIDS, and is being used for a possible malaria vaccine. And so scientists, was able to get rid of basically smallpox, polio, and other things because of vaccinations, although some of these things are coming back because people are disdaining vaccines for some reason or another. And so some of these things are coming back because people are not getting vaccinated, and therefore, it's giving host to these viruses. And so wherever you're at with that, there are scientists and geneticists who are experts in these fields that are Christians, and they're amazed at what God did to prepare people. Even though, as a whole, humanity and the governments of this world failed in addressing COVID-19 and things, the scientific community feels like that we were in a much better position and was able to manage it much better, and it could have been far worse. Now, wherever you fall at on that, I don't know, but I've been told that the vaccines are the mark of the beast. And, you go through that, the black strip on credit cards, that's the barcodes that you scan to buy your groceries, computers, www, 666, the internet, all of these things. In recent history, I've been, the end of the world was 2000, January, the changeover of January 2000. Then you had, 9/11 in 2001. So January 1st of 2000, computers were, this apocalypse is going to take place because all the computers are going to crash around the world, changing from 1999 to 2000. Then September 11, 2001, Then you had, before that, again, there's the guy that wrote the book 88 Reasons Why Jesus Coming in 1988, and he messed up and he meant 89, and then sold more books, 89 Reasons Why He's Coming in 89, and then that didn't happen. And all these people have prophesied the coming of Christ, and then the whole Mayan thing with the 2012 and that calendar. And now, I'm not sure where you fall on this spectrum, but I think through these litany of examples, you can see where in the past mistakes have been made. And the question is, are we making those same mistakes and repeating them again? So as we look at prophecy in the Bible and we read this corpus, this body of literature, are we getting out of it what God intended? Or are we appropriating it in a way that God never intended? And so there's a balance, and I'm not trying to discredit what you believe. I'm just asking you to apply some critical thinking to how the Bible is often read and ask yourself, which is the better reading? Thus, the problem is not necessarily the text by any means. We should start with our interpretation. The problem may be with our way of reading or another person's way of reading the text. We should start there. The text should be considered innocent until proven guilty, and we may have readings that are not in alignment with what was intended originally. And we must be willing to accept that fact and make a reasonable choice to understand that that is a possibility that is often overlooked. And that's all I'm trying to do here, not trying to assert what I think is there, but asking you to think more critically about the way you read it or others have read it to know whether they might have a better reading than your previous readings or not. I hope you like this series, and we'll come back as we continue in part 7 next time. Thank you very much, and God bless you for listening. Stay tuned for more episodes in videos to help you with your journey from nomorec.com.